السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on prophetic hadith, in which we're looking at Ibn Abi Jamra's Mukhtasar Sahih al-Bukhari, we are, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at lesson number 12. And these hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, like anything else, we have to, and this is very important for students of knowledge, right? Or for anyone studying, right? That don't allow your routines of worship or devotion or learning to just become mere routines, right? That it's important to establish routines and habits, but don't allow it to become a mere routine or a mere habit. That, okay, Sundays I have this class. So what are you doing now? I have this class. What are you doing? I'm doing Mukhtasar Sahih al-Bukhari. That's good, right? But, you know, when it comes to intentions, it works both ways, right? They say, بِالنِّيَّاتِ تَنْقَلِبْ الْعَادَاتُ ibadat, that by intentions, habits transform into acts of worship. And that's the potential of intentions, that mere habits, mere routines, mere worldly practices become acts of worship through intention. But the other is also true, which is that min ghayri niyat تصبح العبادات مثل العادات, right? That without high intentions, one's acts of worship can become just mere habits, right? And it's one of the most amazing things, right? This happens with people who, you know, they're praying and they're doing all this prayer, and then, you know, and then they're despondent. Why? Because they're just doing the prayer because it's good to do. But we don't, without intentions, we don't realize the meaningfulness of what we're engaged in. And same with seeking knowledge. That sometimes students of knowledge are like, I wonder what this, and I wonder what this, and they're full of these humum, whereas if you consider what you're engaged in, right? What greater thing could you be engaged in than, you know, if you're seeking knowledge, that you be seeking sacred knowledge, right? Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din. Whomever Allah wishes well for, He grants deep understanding of the religion. And learning is a means to deep understanding of religion. Right? And that's why, and similarly with spiritual practices and our worship and all these other things as well, that how could a person who is doing anything in life to seek the pleasure of Allah, whether serving, whether worshipping, or serving, or seeking knowledge, be worried about seeking the pleasure of Allah in a burdened way? Rather, you are doing what is pleasing to Allah. All that remains is intention, consistency, striving for excellence. right? Which is why, they say that one of the most neglected of sunnahs is al-farahu billah, is rejoicing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And it's commanded. In January, we had our critical issue seminar, and we looked at the critical issue of striving for uprightness. And one of the pillars of remaining steadfast on uprightness, as the Prophet ﷺ tells us, is فَسَدِّدُوا وَقَارِبُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا. So remain steadfastly committed. Do the best you can and be of glad tidings, right? But part of that is to renew one's intentions actively and consistently, right? Is to renew one's intentions actively and consistently, right? So when we approach a text like this, it's important, right, that we really pause, right, and have gratitude, right, and gratitude that we have in a collection like Sahih al-Bukhari, with surety, right, with surety, the preserved words and teachings of the best of God's creation, right? Right? Pure mercy, right? Right? Pure mercy. So one's attitude in reading hadith should be one of pure delight, right? Pure delight, right? So today in lesson 12 we're going to begin bi'idhnillahi ta'ala by looking at a very thought-provoking hadith, and that's the hadith of shepherding, right? The Prophet we relate with our chains of transmission through various teachers back to Ibn Abi Jamra, and with those and other chains of transmission back to Imam al-Bukhari himself, with his chains of transmission, عن عبد الله بن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه يقول. So Abdullah ibn Umar, may Allah be well pleased with him, relates, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. That each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is responsible for their flock. الإمام راع ومسؤول عن رعيته والرجل راع في أهله وهو مسؤول عن رعيته. Each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is responsible for their flock. The leader is a shepherd and is responsible for their flock. And a man is a shepherd in their family and is responsible for his flock. وَالْمَرْأَةُ رَاعِيَةٌ فِي بَيْتِ زَوْجِهَا. And the woman is a shepherd in her husband's home, and she is responsible for her flock. وَالْخَادِمُ رَاعٍ فِي مَالِ سَيِّدِهِ. And the servant is a shepherd with respect to his master's wealth or property, and is responsible for his flock or what is under his command. قال وحسبت أنه أن قد قال والرجل راع في مال أبيه. And he said, and I think he also said, and a man is responsible for his father's property, right? So here, there are many lessons in this, of course, right? 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 So, ra'in, to be a shepherd, ri'aya is to take care of something, right? Each of you is, ri'aya, which we can translate as a shepherd because that's how it's used, but each of you is entrusted. So ra'in, which you can translate here as a shepherd, purposefully, because it gives us an image of how you deal with yourself and how you deal with others. This idea of shepherding, right? Because a shepherd, under his charge, the sheep behave like sheep behave. There's different kinds of sheep. There's sheep that go straight. There's sheep that are stubborn. There are sheep that are hasty. There are sheep that, run away. There's sheep that slow you down. There's sheep that keep getting in trouble, right? There's sheep that fight with each other. There's sheep that complain, right? But the first part is neglected, right? That each of you is a shepherd, right? We can also translate this, each of you is entrusted, right? And is responsible for what they were entrusted with, right? كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. Each of you is entrusted. راع is shepherd, but in the sense of is entrusted, right? And each of you is responsible for their trust, for what they have been entrusted with. You are responsible, مسؤول, you have مسؤولية تكليف, the responsibility of being morally accountable in this life, ومسؤولية محاسبة في الآخرة, and the responsibility of being questioned about it in the hereafter, right? And each of you is responsible, مسؤول. From مسؤول you have the idea of مسؤولية, what you are responsible for. That responsibility has taklif in this life and muhasaba, right, in the next life. Right? Right? And so each of you is a shepherd and each of you is responsible for their flock. But the first part, right, this idea of each of you a shepherd, each of you a shepherd, firstly over your own self, right? Each of you is entrusted and each of you is responsible with respect to what they're entrusted with, right? What are you responsible for? You're responsible for your heart, because that is the locus of faith, the qalb, right? You are responsible for your faith, your iman, the locus of iman and the locus of Islam, your faith and your commitment to submit to God. Its locus is your heart. How you live faithfully and submissively is manifest on your limbs. So each of you is responsible for their heart. And each of you is taken into account and held responsible for what they have been entrusted with, right? So you're entrusted with your heart, that you have faith and have a commitment to submit, that you seek God. And then that is manifest most immediately outwardly. Each of you is entrusted with each of your limbs. Each of them is a blessing and a trust. Insofar as they're a blessing, gratitude is due. Each of them is a trust. So you must fulfill what you are entrusted with. Right? So these are the outward limbs. But then the heart itself is entrusted with its states and states with Allah. Right? It's hal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The states of hope and fear, gratitude and steadfastness, reliance and trust, contentment, being pleased with Allah, having a good opinion of Allah, and entrusted with respect to its character and attitude towards Allah's creation. Salamat al-sadr, keeping a heart free of negativity towards others. Wa husn al-dhann bi-ibadillah, to have a good opinion of Allah's servants. Wa iradatul khayri lahum, seeking good for them, which is qalbun nush, which is the heart of sincere concern for them. But in this metaphor is also a reminder that within you, you have all kinds of tendencies. You have pious tendencies. Some, their mind is very helpful, right, to them. So you say, okay, this is what I need to do. They're very reason focused. Their reason goes straight. But their heart doesn't really get into it. Their emotions go all over the place, right? So we have all these faculties, right? We have our desires, our whim, our intellect, our heart, our soul. For a lot of us, our soul, we are just carrying, you know, a sleeper, right? In some cave of your heart is the true star of your existence, right? Which is your soul, but it's asleep, right? And it's only when it's like you've got your Barcelona and Messi is in the dressing room, right? And you're wondering why you're not winning, because you got to engage the very star of your existence, right? Because I'm not a fan of Barcelona or Messi, but either way, right? Like you're wondering what's going on, right? Your soul's not there, your heart's not in it, right? The heart is a faculty that seeks the pleasure of Allah. So you're in the misery of just your desires and whims and your emotions, and the intellect on its own is trying to deal with these, right? And that's just your B team, right? You won't achieve your goals until you put your, the stars of your team. Who's the stars of your team? Your heart and your soul. Right? The intellect is at best a defender. Okay? It'll hold the fort for a little while. Right? It'll hold the fort for a little while. But it's very limited. It's very limited because the intellect say, yeah, we got to seek the pleasure of Allah. But the intellect has limited capacity to inspire, to drive, right? It can, that's not its role. So you got to get the whole team working together, right? And to know that you have at different times each of your various faculties and tendencies, the flock of your own existence could be in different configurations. Right? So it's an amazing, amazing hadith on self-management, right? You're a shepherd. But the shepherd, the flock is not yours. Right? The flock is not yours. It's an amana. You're working for somebody. Right? You as a shepherd over yourself, you are working for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anta Abdullah. You are a servant of Allah. The flock, these faculties belong to God. Each of these faculties is a blessing. Your desires are a blessing and a test. Your whims are a blessing and a test. Your intellect is a blessing and a test. Your heart is a blessing and a test. Your soul is a blessing and a test. The biggest test is wake up. Wake up your soul. Okay? Okay? Wake up your soul. Right? How? By remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So each of you is a shepherd, each of you is responsible for their flock. Right? Right? And you have to deliver your flock back to your master. Right? So that at the moment of death, you have delivered your trust fully. But your flock is not just you yourself. Those around you are also part of your flock. Right? That each of us has the first part of the hadith has to do with self-shepherding. Right? الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. That's a personal responsibility. But each of us has a public responsibility. And that public responsibility is an immediate public responsibility, or you can say an immediate social responsibility, which is in one's immediate circle of relationships. Okay. And the Prophet ﷺ used the example of family, because that's one immediate circle of responsibility. Right? And you have responsibility there. Why? Because we can understand this rationally, because your interests cannot be fulfilled most fully except through the context of these social networks, of family, of friendship, of community, of society, of humanity. And we have to be shepherds in these, in the sense that these are blessings that we must recognize and trusts that we must fulfill. These are opportunities in the next life for reward, and they are matters we will be held to account for with respect to the discharging of the trust. How do we fulfill it? بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. By being just, which is ada'ul haqq, which is to fulfill what is due, and ihsan, which is to strive to excel. Right? Right? So, and that's how. But each of these, each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is, the husband is a shepherd. Right? So the husband's role, and likewise the wife's role, the child's role, the employee's role, it's a trust. It's a trust. Right? Each of you is a shepherd, meaning each of you has been entrusted. Your wife, your husband, your children, your parents have been entrusted to you. And they're a blessing, a trust. And you have, insofar as their blessing, you have an opportunity of good. Insofar as their trust, you must be careful to fulfill the rights. When our firstborn came, I took him to visit. Took him a few days later to Sheikh Nuh Keller, right? And he did the tahniq, And he said, I just have one advice. He said that your children are not yours. Okay? They're a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a trust. Your responsibility is to have gratitude and to strive to fulfill your trust. But they are Allah's and they're in Allah's hands. Right? And to have certitude regarding that. Right? Similarly in our relationships, right? That's how it's not about you and the other person. It's a trust. You have a trust, you are entrusted with yourself, and you are entrusted with respect to them. Right? So if we look at some of the lessons of this hadith, right? The role of the shepherd, right? Of how does the shepherd fulfill their role, right? The shepherd needs to have thoughtfulness, consideration, patience, purpose. They have to think about the outcomes of matters. Each of you is shepherd, right? It is the wise shepherd, the patient, wise shepherd that succeeds. Right? Right? So imagine if the shepherd decides, okay, every sheep that is giving me trouble, I'm going to slaughter them and hold a feast. Right? What's going to happen in a week's time when you have to take the flock back to the master? There's nobody left. We had a lot of feasts, but you had nothing left. Right? So the wise shepherd, the successful shepherd has to be wise. They have to be patient. Right? And you have to be wise and patient with yourself. You have to consider consequences. That's one of the key aspects of being a shepherd, even to yourself. Sometimes you have to be patient with yourself. The shepherd is a diplomat. You can't fight the sheep. You don't argue with the sheep. Imagine if the shepherd, there's some sheep stuck in the bush, you're talking to the sheep. You'll realize that the shepherd, that talk doesn't get you anywhere. Right? Most of what a shepherd achieves is achieved indirectly. Right? The sheep goes in the bush, you don't drag them out of the bush because they'll get cut up by the thorns. You give the sheep a hard time, it'll create a mess for you. But a little nudge here, a little prod there, pointing them indirectly towards a pasture, and they'll run themselves. The shepherd that is successful inspires their flock in the direction that they want to go. Right? The wise sheep says very little and lets the flock get to the direction. Right? The wise sheep leads from behind. Right? In that it's the flock that is headed towards the direction, but the direction and the goal was set by the shepherd. Right? That you have to inspire yourself to go towards God. Right? And if you can instill that purpose within yourself, right? لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَ, of the one who is ever hopeful and longing for Allah and the next day. You instill that within yourself. إِذَا حَلَّتِ الْهِدَايَةُ قَلْبًا نَشِطَتْ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ الْأَعْضَاءُ, as Imam al-Busiri mentions about the devoted childhood of the Prophet ﷺ. If guidance becomes rooted in the heart, the limbs will follow thereafter in following. What is guidance? It's a clear sense of the way to God and a clear sense of why to pursue that way. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. That you know why you are on this path and where does the path lead and why you're on that path and how you are to be on that path. Right? That's how you set. Those are the purposeful habits that the wise shepherd sets. But sheep forget. So they need reminders. They need nudging and prodding. They need repeated inspiration. And so each of you is a shepherd, right? And this is closely related to certain central concepts, right? That this idea that each of you is a shepherd is related to Iman. The ulama tell us is related to these 4 or 5 core values, to Iman. And that you see with respect to your personal duty to God and your social duties to God. Right? All your relationships are not, your marriage is not about you and your wife or you and your husband. It's about Allah. What you're doing is you are fulfilling, you're recognizing blessing and fulfilling your trust. Now you don't go tell your wife that, by the way, none of this is about you. Right? Right? You go visit a friend and say, Aghain, I'm not coming here for you. It's about God. No. Right? But this is related to how we view ourselves. I am a servant of God. How we view our relationships with others. That these are faithful relationships. And that's why they're sincere. They're not transactional. They're pure relationships because they're for Allah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, in Surah Rum, on verses related specifically to marriage, but they're not limited to marriage. Right? وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. From His signs is that Allah has created for you from amongst yourselves spouses. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. And He has placed between you love and mercy. Now just let's look at this verse grammatically. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ. From His signs, from Allah's signs. And خَلَقَ لَكُمْ. That He has created for you. This lakum here, what does it go back to? Folks? He has created for... Sorry?
It returns to khalaqa.
خَلَقَ huwa lakum. But what is the kum? The lakum created for you. Who is the you referring to in the plural? Mankind. Right? It's general. It's am. That He has created for you, from His signs is that created for you. خَلَقَ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ. From amongst yourselves. أَزْوَاجًا. Spouses. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. So that you may find serenity therein. Okay. So He's created for you, O humanity. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ. And He has placed between you. The second you is also general. What does it go back to?
Azwaj?
No. Now contextually, yes, it does refer. And He has placed between you, meaning placed between the two spouses. But first look at it grammatically, and that's why also when it comes to tafsir, right? a specific contextual explanation does not negate the general indication of the verse, right? That from his signs as he has created for you, O humanity, from amongst yourselves spouses. So you may find serenity therein. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. He has placed between you love and mercy. Right? Now, contextually, yes. Does that apply to spouses? Yes. But the first lakum goes back to humanity. Why would the second lakum, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ, and He's placed between you. The second, بَيْنَكُمْ, goes back to the same people being addressed first. Who's being addressed by the first? You. The first, lakum. Who does it refer to? All people. And وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ is placed between you love and mercy. Yes, He has placed between the two spouses love and mercy, and it's your responsibility to recognize that and fulfill what that entails. But He has placed between you love and mercy, placed between you, O humanity, love and mercy. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you believes until they love for others all that they love for themselves. Right? Right? So this faith entails love of others. Why? Because they're Allah's creation. They're a blessing for you and a trust. They're a blessing both in the good that they facilitate for you or that they're an opportunity of, but they're also a blessing in all the trouble they cause you. Because were it not for the trouble, where would the reward be? Right, so let's say there's some random sister named Halima. Her neighbor is awful. Right? It's a blessing because by being patient, by all these things, she has the opportunity of fulfilling the trust. Okay? Right? To have this sense of love. هَذَا خَلْقُ اللَّهِ. This is the creation of Allah. This is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both in its good and in its bad. And it's an opportunity. And it's a trust. Likewise with mercy. Right? With mercy. To look at creation with the eye of love and mercy. To seek good for them. الرَّحِمُونَ يَرْحَمْهُمُ الرَّحْمَنُ. It is the merciful who are granted mercy by the All-Merciful. إِرْحَمُوا مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Be merciful to all those on earth. يَرْحَمْكُمْ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاءِ. And the Lord of the heavens will be merciful to you. Right? So that's the framework of our relationship. Right? That how do we deal with others? Right? We look at them with the eye of faith. Right? They're a blessing, trust, opportunity, and accountability. So how do we relate to them? Then we relate faithfully. Lillah. We view them with the eye of love. Right? It's one of the very interesting scholars of Damascus, from a great scholarly family, Sheikh Abdul Aziz al-Khatib. And he was visiting northern Syria, and he got unwell. And that part of Syria has a lot of people from a particular sect that the ruling classes are part of, the Alawites. And the doctor he had to go, the only doctor that was available, it was an urgent condition, thing that needed urgent attention, was from that sect. So while he was lying on the medical bed, and the guy had some kind of medical instrument in that, said, "Do you like the Alawiyya, the Alawites?" The Sheikh said, I wanted to tell him what I really felt, but I paused for a second and I reminded myself that هَذَا خَلْقُ اللَّهِ, this is Allah's creating. And that at the broad level, we view everything with the eye of love and mercy. We want good for everybody, even the people whose beliefs or actions whose wrongdoing we hate. We hate the action, not the person. So he said, yes, I love them and I want good for them. The guy was a bit disarmed, of course, right? And we have nasiha, right? We want good. Ad-deenu nasiha, right? Religion itself is this sincere concern, this goodwill, this actively seeking good with respect to another. And through all of this, ultimately the greatest good we seek for them is the prophetic concern, which is ad'u ila Allah. I am calling to Allah. Calling to Allah, not just bil aqwal, not just with one's words, but also with the a'mal, with my actions. Calling to Allah with my adab, with my state, because the state calls to Allah more than the words do. Right? Right? So this is the framework by which we fulfill all these trusts, right? So Zubair got Zubaydah upset because she made 25 kilos of biryani for a lot of people. But then there's a particular dish she had to put in, salt and some spices. And 25 kilos, there's a lot of salt that goes in. Zubair goes and neglectfully he puts sugar instead of the salt. Okay? And instead of putting the apple cider vinegar, he puts apple juice into the biryani. So sugar and apple juice. Now how does Zubaydah respond to Zubair there? Right? This is the framework. Each of you is a shepherd. You are responsible for yourself and your faculties and how you direct them towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in your dealings with others, you are responsible for shepherding that relationship. And this is the framework. Look at it faithfully. He in this moment is from Allah. You look at with the eye of love and mercy, and you want good, right? And you want good, there's no erase button to what happened. You say, okay, what can we do about it now? Right? And through your response, you are calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Through your words, through your actions, through your adab, through your khuluq, and through your hal. Right? Through your actions, through your words. That's the most immediate. Right? Then your actions, then your adab, then your khuluq. Right? And your state. What's your state? Strive to be present with God. Right? And all these relationships that are mentioned exhibit that. Right? The husband with respect to his family, the wife in the household, the children with their parents, the children with each other. Right? This applies to the teacher with their students, the student with their teacher, the child when entrusted with their parents' wealth or their parents' business or their parents' line of work, whatever. These are all trusts. And the general principle is, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ. Truly Allah commands you, أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا. That you fulfill trusts to those they are due to. Right? And who is the entrusting? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a model. Right? There's a model, a blueprint. How do you discharge trusts? It may seem difficult. It's not. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. Truly you have in the Messenger of Allah the most beautiful of examples. لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُ اللَّهُ الْيَوْمَ الْآخِرِ. For whoever longs for Allah and the last day. How do you fulfill trusts? وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا, and makes much remembrance of Allah. Right? So this is an amazing hadith, right? And a lot more can be said about this hadith, but we wanted to touch upon some of the lessons of this hadith and to give a little bit of a framework about this hadith. Now the word, there's some key words here. Ri'aya, of taking care of something, because it's a trust. Mas'ul, to be, which is it's a maf'ul from sa'ala, yas'alu su'alan, to be asked, right? To be, there's a sense of being responsible, that which you will be asked about, i.e., accountable in the hereafter. Right? And then, of course, there's an interesting aspect that this in Sahih al-Bukhari, of all places, right? This is mentioned in the chapter on Friday prayer. Why would this hadith be mentioned in the chapter on Friday prayer?
Is a condition, according to us, it's a condition, and Shafi'is use this as proof that the iman is not a condition.
No, but why is this mentioned in the chapter on Jumu'ah? Right? There's a general principle and there's specific details, right? The general principle is that the one giving khutbah, right? What is the purpose of the khutbah? This is a responsibility, right? With respect to the flock, right? That what do, that the imam, right, in the khutbah, in establishing the khutbah, does so in a manner that takes into account the state, circumstances, need, and benefit. The state, the circumstances, the need, and the benefit of those attending, to facilitate for them to benefit with the benefit they need, given where they are, to be able to embrace their faith, better submit to God, better do the good, better seek the pleasure of God, right? Through that is the dhikr. فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. When the call is given on Friday, then rush to the remembrance of Allah. But the remembrance, the dhikr, the tadhkir, the effective reminder, is the one that is aware of where the reminded are, and what the reminded need, and how to remind them, and with what to remind them, so that they may take heed and be inspired and empowered to pursue the straight path. There's also, of course, a matter of that Imam al-Ghazali is making the argument that the Friday khutbah can also be given in villages. But the hadith does not indicate that. Now, it's important to realize that Imam Bukhari's chapter headings are brilliant, but that is his fiqh and his deduction. Right? So Imam al-Bukhari puts it in a chapter heading, right? في إقامة باب الجمعة في القرى والمدن, establishing the Friday prayer in villages and in towns. Now, some people, they read the chapter heading and say, this hadith is proof. Can anyone tell me, does the hadith mention villages or towns? See, Jacob, is there any mention in this hadith about villages or towns?
No.
No. Right? So, okay. Right? Imam al-Bukhari is making a certain line of argument in his chapter headings. But, right, there are, in the matters of difference, just because someone mentions that this is proof for my position, like some people get, oh my God, look, this is proof. Say, hold on, right? The chapter headings are not from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They're from Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala. Number one. Number two, fihi khilaf, right? Number three, Imam al-Bukhari is an imam in the science of hadith, right? He is a brilliant scholar, but he is not one of the mujtahid imams in fiqh. He was at a high level of fiqh, but that was not his area of scholarly authority. Right? And his chapter headings are brilliant, and we're not diminishing their importance and value. And Imam al-Bukhari deduces brilliant meanings, right? And and many scholars, Ibn al-Munayyir, and the hadith commentators on Bukhari in general, but Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, and in the 20th century, Sheikh al-Hadith Maulana Muhammad Zakaria al-Kandahlawi wrote commentaries just on the chapter headings on Sahih al-Bukhari. And Sheikh Zakaria's Sharh Tarajim Abwab al-Bukhari is published, multiple editions, some printed in 6 volumes, just explaining the chapter headings, not the hadiths. So a lot of fiqh in there, and a lot of indications of guidance, and it's brilliant. But it's not. That is Imam Bukhari's deduction, and that's a human deduction. Some of it, a lot of it is highly indicative and brilliant. But it's not wahi. It's not revelation. Right? Right? And some of that argument is outside this scope and immediate purpose of what we're looking at, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Any questions before we move on to the next hadith? Okay. Then we go on to hadith number 52. So, this hadith عن أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه يقول كان النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم إذا اشتد البرد بكر بالصلاة فإذا اشتد الحر أبرد بالصلاة. So Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu relates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when it became intensely cold, he would pray early. And when the heat was intense, he would pray when it became cooler. And he says, Yani al-Jum'ah. Right? This part, right, meaning Friday, this is from one of the narrators. Right? Right? This is one of the narrators, gave this explanation. Right? Right? Other narrations are very clear that the Yani al-Jum'ah, this part, meaning the Friday prayer, is from one of the narrators. Right? So, when the cold was intense, the Prophet ﷺ would pray early. And when it would be warm, the Prophet ﷺ would delay till it was cooler. So here, there's a few lessons, right? This applies most firmly to Friday prayer, right? That delaying Friday prayer till cool, because more people come to Friday prayer. And Friday prayer, people travel longer distances, because the basis of Friday prayer is that Friday prayer is performed, in the congregation, in the al-Masjid al-Jami'ah, right? Because the basis is every neighborhood, every area is supposed to have their own masajid, their own masjids, right? This is called Masjid al-Hayy, the neighborhood mosques, right? Or Masjid al-Mahalla. Each locality has its mosque. But Jumu'ah, the basis is that we establish in al-Jami'ah, in the central mosques. So people would have to travel to it, frequently on foot, etc. So you do it at a time when it is cooler. So it facilitates, right? And so the wisdom of it being Friday, but there's two types of specification, right? One type of specification, that the prayer, it's, i.e. Friday, meaning this is a specification to highlight where it's most important. But it's not exclusionary, because we know from other hadiths, like the authentic hadith, أبردوا بظهر. The Prophet ﷺ explicitly commanded, pray dhuhr when it is cool. فإن شدة الحر من فيح جهنم. Because intense heat is from the breaths of hell, right? Right. So other hadiths mention dhuhr prayer. From this, we see some general lessons. Number one, with respect to, so we see other lessons in this hadith. One of them with respect to the prayer, right? The Hanafis saw in this a general principle, that the optimal time to pray is the time that most facilitates people to gather. Because they said Salatul Jama'ah is based on ijtima', on gathering. And they saw through all the individual evidentiary bases that the Prophet ﷺ delayed all the prayers except Maghrib consistently, keeping in mind the public interest. So he would delay Fajr till when it was bright, because it's easier but Fajr is a time of sleep. So then there's the explicit hadiths, right? That أسفروا بالفجر فإنه أعظم للأجر. Pray Fajr when it's bright, for it's greater in reward. If it's hot, to delay dhuhr. If it's intensely hot, أبردوا بالظهر. Pray dhuhr when it's cool. They saw evidentiary bases that what's recommended with Asr is to pray it later in the time, but before the disliked time. That the Prophet ﷺ, in winter months especially, used to delay Isha into 1/3 of the way into the nighttime. They saw in all of this, what is the common shared meaning? It's recommended to delay to pray at the time that most facilitates the congregation, without falling into anything disliked. But the Shafi'is saw it the other way around. Said no. There's other hadiths that indicate that what is the best of actions? As-salatu ala waqtiha. Right? Prayer at its time. And in some narrations that they put together, as-salatu fi awwali waqtiha. Prayer at the first of its times. The Hanafis did not agree with they saw problems in the narration of prayer at the first of its time. And they understood prayer at its time, meaning to pray on time. Right? Pray on time. It does not necessarily indicate pray at the beginning of the time. Right? But the Shafi'is also saw that in general, the best of action, the best of good deeds are those that are done without delay. And each is interpreting these according to their interpretive principles. What we do, we follow in our schools in this, and we respect these differences. So in the Shafi'i school, it's general. The best of times for all the prayers is the beginning of the time, unless there's a strong excuse to the contrary. Right? And you can see the details in the Shafi'i books. The Hanafi said, no, if you're praying on your own, generally it's best to pray at the beginning of the time. But if you're praying in congregation, then, especially the public congregation, you pray in the way that most facilitates the congregation for people. Right? Right? So this is an example of there's a body of hadiths that are sound. How do you piece them together? Right? That's what requires ijtihad. Right? And it requires not whimsical ijtihad that, well, let's see what makes sense to me, but it requires principled application of sound interpretive methodology. And then finally, there's a personal lesson as well, right? The idea of yassiru wa la tu'assiru, right? Of make things easy for yourself. Make things easy and do not make them difficult. That you facilitate for others, right? To fulfill their duties facilitatively. But the ease that Allah and His Messenger call us to do, to find, yassiru, make things easy, this is facilitative ease, is to approach things in a manner that makes it easy to do that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not make things easy that be a slacker, right? Right? That just do the minimum. No. The taysir is to make easy for people to pursue the path towards their good. Right? It's a taysir and nasih. Right? It is the facilitation of sincere concern for their good. Why? Imam al-Shatibi, in his Muwafaqat, which is a much abused book in the modern times, says that ease, right, is of two types. There's the ease of this life and the ease of the next. Just as the masalih, the interests that the sacred law, right, has come to consider are of two types. The masalih al-dunya and masalih al-akhirah, the interests of this life and the interests of the next. Right? And Imam al-Shatibi, in a beautiful passage, says that the interests, the benefits that the Sharia has come directly to preserve and promote are the benefits and interests of the next life. As for the benefits and interests of this life, they are considered only insofar as they are a means or a facilitation to the fulfillment of the benefits and interests of the next world, or insofar as they don't compromise or detract from the attainment of next worldly interests. So taysir, facilitation, is not let people do whatever they want so that they can just get on with their dunya and forget the akhirah. Right? That's why Sheikh Nuh Keller puts it so powerfully. He says, any understanding of deen that diminishes deen in the lives of people is not deen, but deception. Right? Any understanding of deen that reduces deen in the lives of people is not deen, it is deception. Right? It's not nusх. It's not goodwill. Right? It's khiyana. It's you're cheating somebody. Right? That's why Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Shadhili said, "Man dallaka ala dunya faqad ghashaka." Right? Whoever points you towards worldliness has cheated you. وَمَن دَلَّكَ عَلَى الْعَمَلِ فَقَدْ أَتْعَبَكَ. And whoever just points you towards actions has just tired you out. وَمَن دَلَّكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَقَدْ نَصَحَكَ. And whoever guides you towards Allah has been of sincere counsel to you. Right? Why? Because somebody, like, of course, how do you guide people to Allah? You guide people to Allah by telling them what they can do and how to do it and why they're doing it. But the purpose is not the action, but the one you're acting for. Someone says, I'd like to start practicing. So you say, do this, and this. You just tired them out. You have to connect your counsel to guiding them to Allah. The facilitation is that let people start with small things and be gradual. The way, show them the practical way of implementing things, but in a way that builds, right? That is, assisting people in fulfilling their duty to God facilitatively, right? Okay, you may start with the minimum, but don't say you only have to do this. No, give them a little bit, and then gradually nurture them. Kunu Rabbaniyin, be nurturing scholars, right? Be lordly scholars. Nurturing, help people build up slowly. But it's not just say just do that and forget about Allah and His Messenger. Right? Kunu Rabbaniyin, be nurturing scholars and guides. Be nurturing in your relationships. So you give them a little bit, then a little more, but towards what's good, their ultimate good. That is facilitation, right? But kunu rabbaniyin also means lordly. Help creation connect to the Creator. Help creation connect to the Creator. Okay, so we're going to stop here today. We wanted to go at length on the hadith of shepherding. Next week we're going to continue from hadith number 53, and that needs quite a bit of explanation, which is the hadith on the Friday sermon and the sunnah. So we'll make that part 2 of this lesson and we'll be going till about hadith number 60. But so prepare ahead if you're able to, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala sayyidina wa nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Any questions before we close?
Going back to the hadith on shepherding, how does one acquire good leadership skills? For example, with one's family, with one's children, or the like.
How does one acquire good leadership skills? I mean, there's knowledge, observation, and practice, right? So knowledge, one learns, right? One learns the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. One learns the guidance of the ulama related to what is one's responsibility, how one discharges it with excellence, right? From the hadith related to it and the teaching of the ulama regarding any of these areas, right? Observation is observe those who do it well. Observation and also consultation. Right? أَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُم. Their affairs are through consultation between each other, right? So one consults. And then practice, that what one learns, one implements it, right? And through successive approximations, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, Al-qasd tablughu. Remain committed, and you shall reach, right? So it takes, successive approximations to attain, right? And as they say, ليس على المرء أن يدرك النجاح. A person is not responsible to succeed. وإنما عليه أن يسعى. Rather, their responsibility is but to strive. Any other questions?
Question online. What school of thought did Imam Bukhari follow?
What school of thought did Imam al-Bukhari follow? At that time, the madahib were, were not formalized to some extent, right? Particularly amongst the Ahl al-Hadith, for example. So Imam al-Bukhari took his fiqh largely from those who took their fiqh from Imam Ahmad, and particularly from those who took their fiqh from Imam al-Shafi'i. And he was essentially, so he's generally would be considered to be Shafi'i oriented in his fiqh, right? So if you look in works, although sometimes there's a little case of overstatement, but in the Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya al-Kubra, etc., he's listed amongst the Shafi'i scholars. But he wasn't strictly speaking a Shafi'i in the sense that, he took taken his fiqh from largely from those who were, who took their fiqh from those who took it from Imam Shafi'i. He was a generation or two after. But he was also at a certain level of ijtihad, so he has his own choices and so on, but he'd also learned, so he was at a certain level of ijtihad, and he had a number of legal influences, but he is not cited as an authority and that notwithstanding, he is not cited as an authority in fiqh. Though he is full of legal and religious insight in his chapter headings. Any other questions?
Four goals, 3 points. You must be.
I have a question.
Bismillah.
This is kind of a follow-up to the last one. I always thought that, or the impression I got was that Central Asia was the heartland of the Hanafis. So, how did all these muhaddithin come to that?
No, it was the heartland of the Hanafis, but does not mean it was Hanafi only land, right? Where was Imam Bukhari? Right? Not just where was Imam Ahmad? So if we look at the Imams of fiqh, where was Imam Ahmad? He was in Iraq, right? He also, of course, had a deep strand of influence particularly from the writings of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan But these lands, they are vibrant lands, right? They had many different strains of scholars and so on. And there's other mujtahid imams in that era as well. In Iraq, you also have Ibn Abi Layla and others, right? And even, you know, the great imams of hadith, the sort of the and those lands, the eastern lands, places like Khurasan, for example, both Iraq and Khurasan had a lot of great Shafi'is, but they were a minority. But Khurasan particularly, you had these great Shafi'is in those lands, right? And Marw, and you know, far into the eastern lands, you had great centers of Shafi'i scholarship. And that's from the beautiful diversity of our deen, right? You find some great Hanbali imams in modern day Afghanistan, right? Khwaja Abdullah al-Ansari, he was known as, also known as Abdullah al-Harawi, right? He was from Herat. Harawi is from Herat. And he wrote one of the great works of Tasawwuf, Manazil al-Sa'irin, which Sheikh Walid Mus'ad has been teaching, and he studied it with Sheikh Mahmoud al-Masri, right? And Manazil al-Sa'irin was one of the favorite books in Tasawwuf of Sheikh Muhammad al-Hashimi, Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Shaghuri's spiritual guide. And he was from Herat, but he was a Hanbali. He was a great hadith scholar, he was a great Sufi, but he was a great muhaddith as well, and he was Hanbali in fiqh. And that's from, there are Malikis in Baghdad, and the madhab sort of went west, but you find great Malikis for over a millennium in what is modern day Tunisia. And under the Ottomans, fatwa in what is modern day Tunisia was under the Hanafi school, right? So we say the western lands of Islam are Maliki, but it's not just Maliki and Maliki only. You have Hanafis and others in places like Libya and Iraq. Similarly, the east coast of Africa has produced great Hanafis. The Zayla'is, where is Zayla? Do you know?
In Somalia?
Yeah, it's on the east coast, right? Right? Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubugha is from the lands of Sudan, right? And right? So you find, there's this rich diversity in many, right? So the city of Zayla, or Zayla, right, is very, it's very significant. Like, and even places like Eritrea, which is, you find in Ethiopia and Eritrea, you find Malikis, Shafi'is, and Hanafis, right? Some of this shriveled because whenever there's, there is political and economic strength and stability and stuff, you find a flourishing of scholarship. But then, when there's political chaos, or like during the colonial era, for example, and funding completely shrivels, what do you happen? You have the survival of the predominant very often, right? Not always, but frequently. So you find far fewer of those scholars, right? Less like India, right? everyone knows that there's a lot of Shafi'is in Kerala, and Kerala is predominantly Shafi'id, or the Malabar coast. One of the greatest students of Imam Ibn Hajar is Imam Zainuddin al-Mallibari, right? From from modern day Kerala, right? They have centuries and centuries of Shafi'i scholarship. However, you find great Shafi'i scholars up and down the Indian subcontinent, right? Sheikh Badib wrote a lot of his graduate research on the efforts, the services of the scholars of India or the contributions of the scholars of India in serving the Shafi'i school, and the contributions of the ulama of Hadramaut in knowledge and da'wah in the Indian subcontinent. And he found thousands of manuscripts of Hadrami scholars all across India. And in fiqh, nearly all of these were Shafi'i. There's madaris and teaching of the Shafi'i school across India, especially in places like, besides Malabar, which is on the southwestern coast, but in Hyderabad and Mysore and Delhi and the surrounding towns in what is modern day UP, and elsewhere, and in Lahore. And I don't think Sheikh Badib necessarily went to Lahore, but across the board. And you find Kashmiri Shafi'is. There's a long tradition of Kashmiri Shafi'is. That's just part of the beautiful diversity of our deen, right? But when funding disappears and people are just in survival mode, then you have the survival of the stronger, typically, right? And also because the ulama are pragmatic, just like in many places, right? Some people say, how come the scholars in such and such land just focus on a couple of sciences? Because they're seeking to preserve. They're seeking to preserve, right? So what do you preserve? What's most important, right? You see in Hadramaut, especially in Tarim, for example, people say, oh, what they do, that certainly the public teaching, sort of they focus in on what's most important, but there's a great tradition in Hadramaut of teaching, and recently Sheikh Badib wrote about it, and he's been writing about it for ages, because his own ancestors for generations have been teaching Sahih al-Bukhari in the town of Shibam, right? Including one of his ancestors, his name was Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad Badib. But he's not the same Sheikh Abu Bakr Badib, but from 100 years ago almost. So, so a lot of there's ebbs and flows of both the range and diversity of Islamic scholarship. So that's, so it's not like, it's not a simple thing that there's no lands that, that were exclusively uni madhab, right? By and large, there are certain lands that were overwhelmingly Hanafi. We have all kinds of people there. One more question, inshallah. Okay, so we'll stop there. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا الذي ينفعنا وزدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا وصدقا وقبولا ورفعة وقربا ورضا يا رب العالمين. وصلي وسلم وبارك على النور المبين سيد الأولين والآخرين إمام المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وأحبابه إلى يوم الدين. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.